So thank you for coming. We're from Nexmo, and Aaron's going to explain in a moment what we do exactly. But the summary is that we provide REST APIs and client libraries in various languages that go with those REST APIs. And we're about to conduct an experiment. We're about to drop support for Python 2 and see what happens. So this talk is really about why we're dropping support for Python 2, why we're moving wholeheartedly into Python 3. And not just Python 3, Python 3.5, and how we're going to go about that to responsibly support our users and attempt to push things forward. So at the end, we won't be taking questions, but because we're one of the sponsors of the conference, we have a booth downstairs, and the primary reason for giving this talk is to get some feedback. So if anybody has any supportive comments or disagreements with us, please come and talk to us at the booth and pick up a free t-shirt at the same time. My name's Mark Smith. My Twitter handle is GD2K. I hang upside down from stuff occasionally. I've been programming in Python for 18 years. Before that, I was a Perl programmer briefly, very briefly. And before that, I was a Java developer. These days, as well as all that stuff, I run the Edinburgh Python user group as well. So I'm highly involved in sort of Python development, Python community.
Yeah, and I'm Bassett. Like Mark, I'm also a software engineer turned developer advocate. This is also our first time ever doing a joint talk. And we were one slide in, I mucked up and clicked the button by mistake. So we're off to a great start. But yeah, I've been a Python developer for a very long time. I actually help run the Glasgow Python user group. So between the pair of us, we basically have a monopoly on Scotland and Python.
We run Scotland.
Yeah, pretty much. And I work with Mark at Nexmo. So Nexmo, essentially we're just a REST API in telecommunications. So we make it really easy to add like SMS or voice applications into your own projects. So really what we're selling is an API. The way in which developers interact with that API is of utmost importance to us. So we currently have 6 kind of supported languages, officially supported languages. So we've got Ruby, we've got JavaScript, PHP, Python, Java, Objective-C. We have a Go library, which is currently in development. Mark's actually working on that. That's launching later this year, hopefully. Also, our new Python 3 library was supposed to launch before this conference, hopefully, so we'll see how it goes. Mark actually heads up our client libraries at Nexmo, so that's one of his responsibilities, as well as being a Python advocate. So it's a lot on a very small team. And that kind of is why we need to drop support from Python 2. It's one of the reasons that we'll go into later on, is with this very small team, it is a bit of a time sink. So our current Python library, it works. It's got pretty good coverage of all our API endpoints. Do you know off the top of your head roughly what our coverage is?
It's about 96%.
About 96%. Okay, so we have nearly total coverage of all our APIs within the Python client library. But it has its issues as well. Like you can download it now, you can pip install it. You'll be able to send text messages, make voice calls, all that kind of stuff. But the code itself is not very Pythonic, and the way you interact with the library is not very Pythonic. For example, creating a call, it just accepts a dict with a bunch of values. And the reason for that is it's just taking that dict and sending it straight to the API endpoint. And then it takes whatever comes back and presents that back to the users. There's not an awful lot of kind of data checking in there. There's no real error handling. It becomes quite difficult to debug. It's very difficult to read. It's all those things that Python shouldn't be. And as I said, it does work, but it doesn't work in the way that we want it to, and it doesn't give the experience to the developers that we want to give. There's other things as well. The actual client library itself, it was built by somebody who's not a Python developer or wasn't a Python developer at the time, and you can see they've made some mistakes, shall we say, like using double underscores for private methods. So double underscores obviously is going to do your name mangling. It's not really supposed to be for private methods. It's to stop you having clashes between method names. And some of the things that they've used this double underscore for really should be public methods anyway. So there's definitely some problems with the code itself. And not just the code, but the way in which it's structured.
There's some silly things like that all the code is contained in a single class, which is pretty flat. I mean, flat's good. but it should be a single file module, but it's not. It's a package. And it really needs to be split out. Fundamentally, we have separate APIs providing different functionality, and we need to start dividing that into separate namespaces, and then those namespaces need to be classes and modules. So there's some work to be done there. We use JWT for authentication, and when we implemented it, our feeling was that this was an internal detail. The user, as long as they provide the key and their identifier, we generate the JWTs internally and pass them to the APIs. What we've discovered since is that our users quite often need to customize and generate their own valid JWTs, so we really need to expose that work. So we've got various work that we need to do on our library already.
But all these things could be fixed in Python 2. You know, there's nothing that we've talked about so far that is Python 3 only. You know, the ability to expose the JWTs, to fix the file structure, to make it more Pythonic, to get rid of some of the double underscores, all that kind of stuff can be done in Python 2. So other than it just being new and shiny, what's the reason we should move to Python 3? What are we getting from that? So we've got things like keyword-only arguments. So that solves our issue with the large dict being passed into a lot of our method calls. Our APIs do have a lot of optional arguments. And there's no getting away from that. They do a lot of things, and you don't always want them to do all of the things, so you don't always have to pass in all of the data. But with keyword-only arguments, we can ensure that even if we have a long list of optional arguments, that it's still readable.
On top of that, we've got type hints, and I know in general there's a lot of people that don't like the idea of type hints, and I think that stems from the idea that maybe this is going to become compulsory and ultimately Python will evolve into a typed language, and I don't think that's going to happen. But for us, it's a no-brainer. So IDEs like PyCharm and mine's gone blank, Visual Studio Code provide real benefits if you add type hints to your code. Tools like MyPy can validate your code to tell you that you're passing in the right values and dealing with the values that come back to you in the right way, that you're calling methods that actually exist on the types that are being returned to you. So for us, type hinting on our public interface makes loads of sense. We're not type hinting internally because we like writing idiomatic Python code, and that's not idiomatic. But we can really provide assistance to our users by adding type hints to the code. We could put it in PYI files and kind of keep the code compatible with Python 2, but that's a really horrible way to, it's almost entirely duplication, and then every time we change any of our interfaces in a minor way, we've got to go and have a look at the separate PYI file and make sure that it's still in sync with our code, and that's a pretty horrible job. Just on top of all these things, Python 3 gives us lots of goodies. We've got, I mean, just off the top of my head here, we've got pathlib, which is surprisingly nice. One of our methods takes a private key, and it can take that as either a path to a key file, or it can take it as the contents of the private key. And at the moment, we're deciding which one they've sent us by checking for new lines in the string. So we're kind of introspecting the string, and that's pretty horrible, whereas in the future we could say provide us with a path object if it's a path to a file, or provide us with the actual content itself. Pathlib on top of that is just nice for actually reading files and things. It's an awesome little library. We're using enumerations a lot, so enum values are very clear. Also, you can check the type, so you can check that they've sent in a valid value. Some of our APIs, because it's just JSON being passed back from a RESTful API, some of our values are just integers, and they don't mean anything to the user unless they go and find the right table of data and look up the value. So in this case, we're just mapping those ints to an enum type that provide more affordance, more understanding for the user just by looking at the value that's been returned. So we're going to be using enums quite a bit. But the real justification for the rewrite is async. With the increasing popularity of frameworks like Sanic, there was a real need to provide async support, and currently our library is synchronous. It doesn't work in an async environment at all. Aaron wrote a voice broadcast tutorial recently using our APIs with Sanic, and had to just roll his own client library, which is a pretty horrible experience for our users. So this essentially for us means building a whole new library, probably around AIO HTTP. And now we have 2 Python libraries. And if we're going to build a new library anyway, maybe we should fix up the non-async library that we have that we're not entirely happy with at the same time. And if we can do both jobs kind of as much as possible sharing that code, then that's a benefit to us.
So why are we doing this now? Python 2 is not actually being end of life until 2020. So why start now? Why not give ourselves this extra kind of 18 months or whatever it is until then? Well, whenever I first joined Nexmo, we had 5 products. We had our voice API, we had SIP trunking, we had our SMS API, we had Verify, which is like our 2-factor authentication, we had Number Insight, and in the last 6 months, we've actually launched messages and workflows. So the ability to not just send a message via SMS, but to send it via WeChat or via Viber, and to create workflows where you can go, okay, if I send this via text message and the user doesn't respond, then try to reach them via Facebook Messenger instead, or try to reach them via Viber instead.
Do you see 2 of those products have the same icon? I mean, it's difficult keeping our client libraries up to date with new products. We can't even design a new icon for them.
Whenever I was doing out this slide, I actually went back and checked it 3 or 4 times, thinking that I had opened up the wrong image each time, because I hadn't noticed that we have the same icon for 2. But yeah, so we have our messages and workflows, which is just launching. We have Stitch, which is our own IP messaging service, as well as voice messaging, so doing build your own VoIP applications over WebRTC. And these are only things that have launched in the last 6 months. Our Python library, as it stands, is 96% coverage only for the first 5. So we're already adding more features quicker than what we can actually add them into our client libraries. And who knows what we're going to be developing next. It's going to keep running at that same kind of pace. And we're going to have to be adding more and more stuff into different libraries. If we're going to do like pizza over IP or whatever nonsense they come up with as our next product, we don't really want to be having to write that code in multiple places or multiple different libraries. And it's not just writing the code as well. We've got to make sure it works. Our customers or developers, who knows where they're going to be deploying this to? We're probably going to have to work on their local environments if they're like building it on their Macs, or they might be deploying it to a Windows server, or to a Linux server, or to Solaris, or to an IoT device, or anywhere else. And these are all environments that we need to support. We need to make sure that our client libraries work on. So every time we have to support another language version alongside of that, it just increases our kind of workload massively. And okay, there is like some tooling that we can use for it.
There's a library called VCRPY. I don't know if people have heard of it. It's a port of a Ruby library. It essentially stubs out your HTTP library, intercepts the request, makes the request anyway the first time, and then caches the response in a data file, so that in future you can run all these integration tests but offline, but you're running with real data, which is obviously a big benefit. But as I mentioned earlier, we're maintaining 6, 7, 8 client libraries, and each one of those ports of VCR, it does exist for most of those languages. They all use different rules for matching the requests to the responses, for how they store the data, and ultimately rewriting that test code in each environment is going to be pretty painful for us. So one of the things that we're building as part of this, it's slightly irrelevant to the whole Python 3 thing, but we will be open sourcing it in the next year, hopefully, is a server version of this VCR library. So ultimately, you run it as a service alongside your tests. Your tests make local calls, and again, it can pass through the requests if it's configured to do so to the server, bring them back, sanitize them, remove user IDs and passwords and things, and then return the response via HTTP to your client. So we think it's quite a nice solution in this multi-language environment.
That's probably a good thing to mention as well. Is like any of the stuff that we're talking about today, from our client libraries to any of our kind of testing frameworks to even, we'll talk about documentation a little bit, it's all open source. We program everything in the clear, which is a little bit scary, but it's all up there on our GitHub all the time anyway.
Don't read the comments.
Yes, don't read the comments.
So we're talking about building a whole new library, which is a slightly scary thing to do. It's not as bad a decision as it might sound, because the current library, as we mentioned, doesn't do that much at the moment. And if we spend more time on it and it doesn't really get closer to the sort of core that we would like it to be, then that's sort of wasted effort. So the idea is to start now and and build the core that we would like to have, and then get as fast as possible, get up to a good coverage of our APIs. And we have a big advantage with specifically our libraries and the way that we work with doing this. One of which is that client libraries are actually quite repetitive. So most of our methods take a request type object, they map it to an HTTP request, they make that HTTP request, take the response, map it to an object and return it again. So that's nicely repetitive, which lends itself to code generation quite well. Another benefit we have is that we've started documenting all our APIs with Open API specification, OAS 3. It used to be called Swagger, if anybody's come across that before. It's a file format for describing all your endpoints, all the methods, the HTTP methods that can be made against those endpoints, the types, the request parameters, the responses that come back. All the information you would need to build a Pythonic library, essentially, to make requests against that, those endpoints. We spent quite a lot of time looking at different code generators that work with Open API spec, and we haven't really been happy with any of them. There's a few commercial ones that are a bit limited. We weren't very happy with the code that they generated, and some of them can't be customized, so we can't write our own code templates. The most popular one is probably the open source project Swagger CodeGen, and they've only just added support for Open API spec 3. Which is what we're writing, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, it's a good format. But they don't support Python at the moment. There's no documentation. It's difficult to get up and running. So ultimately, we decided to build our own code generator. That's the minimum code generator necessary to transform our Open API specs into Python code using Ginger templates. We're probably not going to open source this thing because it's a bit rough and ready. It really needs to get the code generated, and then we can publish the code. But the side effect of building our own code generator for our own specification files is hopefully it gives us a good bootstrap for other language libraries we might want to build in the future. So we're looking ahead towards Elixir, Swift, Rust, those kinds of languages. So yeah, that's our future.
So there's lots of good reasons as to why we're doing this. You know, we've seen that there's obviously some problems with the existing library. There's going to be some benefits with moving to Python 3. There's going to be a lot of benefits with our saving time, etc., not maintaining them. But there's still the same objections that we get all the time, and they've been coming up both internally, and we've already started talking to people externally about the fact that we were just going to go Python 3 only.
But Aaron, it already works in Python 2. I don't want to upgrade to Python 3.
Great, don't. It's as simple as that. We're not getting rid of our Python 2 library straight away. If you are using it for any of those 5 products that it already works for, great. It's going to continue to keep working with them. If that's all you need, then keep using it. You don't have to do the upgrade. Eventually, it will reach the end of life and it'll stop getting bug fixes or security fixes. But that's going to be in the future whenever Python 2 itself is no longer supported. So we're not going to be your biggest issue at that point. But if it's working for you now, you don't have to upgrade. You can, although we're going to have a Python 3 library, you don't really need to change at all. Which kind of, I suppose, leads to another question mark. And why don't we just support both?
So we're already supporting 6 or 7 libraries, and it feels like supporting a library that either runs on Python 2 or 3 or 2 separate libraries is an extra overhead on top of that. We'd rather not do that. If you work with 6 or even Futurize, you're still really working with the lowest common denominator of Python. Python 3 was released 10 years ago, and I think it's kind of time to start writing more modern libraries in Python, taking advantage of features like keyword-only arguments and those kinds of things. Fundamentally, it's just better and faster to write Python 3 code.
I don't care if it's better or faster for you. Right? This is a commercial library. I pay your wages.
So some of the stats coming out of companies like JetBrains are that 75% of Python developers are actively working on Python 3 projects at the moment. That's gone up from about 55% a year ago, so it's moving quickly. I would rather focus on the majority of our users who are working with Python 3 or moving to Python 3. I have to judge where I spend my time. Aaron already mentioned we're a small team. I'd rather spend my time making our clients richer and better for the majority of our users rather than focusing on an increasingly smaller minority of our users. So what if your sysadmin won't install Python 3, Aaron?
Does that say sysadmin? If your sysadmin won't install Python 3, then having an outdated Nexmo module is probably the least of your worries at this point. Python 2 is going to be end of life in 2020. If you don't already have some form of plan in place to start migrating across to Python 3, yeah, we're not going to be top of your priority list, and nor should we be top of your priority list. Getting just onto Python 3 itself should be top of your priority list. So, does that mean we're just going to completely drop all our Python 2 users? No, of course not. As I kind of jokingly said to Mark, we are a commercial product. Our customers do pay our wages, and some of them still are running Python 2 and will continue to run Python 2 for a while. So we don't want to alienate these people, not only just because they're giving us money, but we like our users. We want to maintain those relationships. We hope that if we do support them well enough, that they might transition across to our Python 3 library. They're not going to have some of the new products. Maybe they'll see some products and want to migrate across. So how can we make things as stable and as painless for them as possible? So we're at 96% coverage on our Python library at the moment, our version 1 library. Once that hits 100% coverage, which is going to be very, very soon, it's going to become our LTS version. So that's our long-term support version. So that will be the last version, essentially, that's going to support Python 2. Last major version, sorry, it's going to support Python 2. It will not receive any new functionality. So Stitch, which is currently in developer preview, will not be added to that library. The messaging and workflows will not be added to that library. It'll get 100% coverage for 5 existing products, and that's where it stops. It will still receive bug fixes, it still will receive security updates, but only until it hits its end of life date. So our end of life date for our Python, or version 1 of our client library that supports Python 2 is going to be 1 year, 8 months, 11 days, 9 hours, and 46 minutes. Which weirdly coincides exactly with when Python 2 hits end of life. It kind of made sense to us that whenever Python 2 hits its end of life, that we can then drop support for our Python 2 client. So we'll still have our LTS version that will probably continue to work against our API for an indefinite amount of time, but we will no longer be providing any kind of bug fixes or security updates or anything to it after that point. So we've got 1 year and 8 months to go. We need to start notifying our users well in advance. We need to let them know that this is going to be happening, that we will be eventually dropping support for Python 2 completely. That they won't be getting security updates anymore. Now we have the usual kind of channels allowing us to do this. We have our blog. We have our Twitter, which is in the bottom corner of every single slide. So there's no excuse for not following us. We have email. We are a paid for product. People do subscribe. We do have their email addresses. We can contact them about that kind of stuff through there. Basically, we need to be shouting it from rooftops, doing talks like this, mentioning it everywhere we can that we are going to be dropping support and the date that we're going to be dropping support. There's also kind of things you can do in Python itself. We do have the ability to send deprecation warnings. So there is a warnings module within Python. So we can have deprecation warnings that come up whenever they do a pip install, or a pip end install, as it is these days. Or we can have it whenever they're importing the module or accessing any of the methods upon that module. So hopefully whenever developers are running this in their development environment, they'll have these deprecation warnings enabled, and they'll start to see these messages coming through, and we can get them, warn them in plenty of time so they can do their upgrades. And then if we do have any holdouts, people who just have not made the migration and we're approaching our end of life date. Well, as I mentioned, we're a paid product. We have to be able to tie people's usage of our APIs to their accounts. So they authenticate with our service via JWT, and we can then link that usage to the correct account and to the correct contact details on that account. And every time that they call any of our APIs as a Python client, the user agent will includes the Python version they're running, as well as the Python client library version that they're running. So we can start to pull stats on how many people are still using one of the Python 2 versions against our API. How many people are using the Python LTS client that's about to be end of life. And then if we still have some of our clients who are using those, we can actually start reaching out to those people individually and hopefully help migrate them across.
So Aaron drew this slide, and I would never have put the word refactoring on there. What we're doing is quite obviously not refactoring.
Yeah, but you're not allowed to use the word rewrite. Nobody likes saying rewrite.
That's true. We're re-architecting at scale.
Yeah, re-architecting at scale, that'll do.
So we want to get the library to a form where we can happily take it forwards as we add new features to our APIs. We're getting up and running as quickly as possible using code generation, and later we want to manually add better support for frameworks like Django and Flask, so we can add persistent objects that map to objects that will be provided by our APIs. We can add better webhook support for validating requests, those kinds of things. And later on, maybe we can add higher-level abstractions to run in your local framework, like state machines and things like that, to manage the state of a call that's ongoing. We are attempting to keep the interfaces similar to the existing interfaces as reasonably possible. So it's easy for you, although users will have to migrate the code manually, it will make sense to them, the steps that they need to make. It's not a complete shift in the way of thinking of the library. And we're making it richer and more Pythonic. We're making it work with async frameworks. And we're not reinventing the wheel. So part of best practices is reusing other people's code. We'll be using Marshmallow and Atters internally for marshalling and unmarshalling the JSON that goes backwards and forwards between the APIs, and building out objects that we compare to each other that work like Pythonic objects. And on top of this, we're also using pip_file to manage our dependencies, because pip_file's cool. It's a lot better than requirements.txt. Although I learned there's a competitor, can't remember the name of it.
There's always a competitor around packaging. Yeah, so obviously the big thing about this is our new client library, but that's not where all the work ends, unfortunately. Yes, we'll have this new, shiny, lovely Python 3 client library, but if people don't understand how to use it, it becomes difficult. So we have our developer documentation. It's super important to us because, as I said, our product is our API, and if people can't use our API, then they can't use our product, and what are they paying us for? So we spend a lot of time working on our docs. We do generate some of them out of the Swagger now OAS 3, what are they called? Specifications, definitions. Yeah, so some of it will be automatically generated for us, but now we need to ensure that we can actually have versioning within our docs, because we are going to be running our Python 2 and our Python 3 libraries concurrently. And while, as Mark mentioned, we're going to try and keep our interface as close to the previous one as we possibly can, there is going to be some differences. And it doesn't matter if those differences are minor or they're major. If you go onto our documentation, you copy some code, you put it into your terminal, your editor, you try to run it and it doesn't work, you're going to go use one of our competitors. So we need to make sure that that our documentation is still up to date, and that it's still really easy for people to find the correct version for the client library they're using, etc. Thankfully, one of our colleagues, Adam, has done a fantastic job on our docs. He actually does a talk about doc ops. All his work that he's done on the toolchain for that, everything is all open source as well. Our entire documentation is all open source. It's actually really pretty amazing how he set it up so that you can so easily contribute to it. I highly recommend his talk. It's very, very good. Even if you're not into documentation at all, it's a very kind of useful and very well engineered talk itself. We do have other types of content too. So we have our blog posts, we have webinars, we have video contents, we have conference talks. We produce a lot of content as a team. And some of that will need to be updated. So some of the more long form tutorials, etc. We'll probably need to update those to the most recent version of the client library. For some of the blog posts, people kind of are aware that blog posts really have a best before date. Client libraries change, code changes, they get outdated. We're still going to have to go through them and make sure that any of them that use the previous library are marked as such, that they have some kind of disclaimer or warning or deprecation notice on them. But for the most part, people are kind of okay with blogs going outdated.
So it's worth noting that this is all on GitHub. We're talking about the future of our library, but the truth is we were really hoping to launch at this conference. It's a software project, so it's running late. And there's not really very much code there at all, because we're doing code generation. Actually, most of the work's going into the code generator behind the scenes. At the moment, we cover a couple of endpoints. But we really are very close. In the next couple of weeks, coverage should go up almost overnight, and then after that, it's just iterating on the templates and the manual code edits afterwards. So that's a guilty admission. So I hope we've given you an idea of some of the interesting things we're doing and how we're making the move to Python 3 only without actually kind of just kicking out all our customers. It's still an experiment for us, but it's really nice to work with modern Python. It's much harder to make this kind of decision when you're a library and your users are using the same version of Python as you. If you're hosting your own products, it doesn't matter so much. Providing you can get Python 3 onto a server, you can move to Python 3. But one of our biggest motivations for moving to Python 3, despite all of the other justifications we've given, is that it's to encourage our customers to move to Python 3. We feel it's important for our community, the Python community, that everybody gets behind the same version of Python so that we can put all our efforts into one version of Python and start moving forwards faster as a community. So thank you very much.
Thank you.